Indigenous Jalisco, the Relación Geográfica por Poncitlán y Cuitzeo. What more can we learn about the Coca indigenous peoples of Jalisco according to the geographic survey of the Coca territories recorded during the 16th century, known as the Relación Geográfica por Poncitlán and Cuitzeo. This was recorded in 1585. In this video, I want to talk about the exciting content contained in this document. And if you are interested in the history of Indigenous Jalisco or anything pre-contact or early colonial Mexico, this video is for you. I just also want to underscore how the Relación Geográfica for Poncitlán and Cuitzeo is so important for studying the history of the Coca indigenous peoples of Jalisco, because the Cocas, of course, not only are they an understudied group in the history of indigenous Jalisco or indigenous Mexico in general, it's the fact that unlike the Nahuas or other groups in central Mexico, where we have a lot of ethnographic sources like the Florentine Codex, we have colonial codices, Codex Mendoza, for example. Unlike those groups, we don't have many ethnographic sources on groups like the Cocas or the Tecuejes or other groups in central West Mexico for that region, especially those so-called Chichimeca groups. Again, there are not many sources that talk about the pre-Hispanic customs of the Cocas. This is one of the very few documents that shed light on their pre-contact custom. For my viewers on TikTok and Instagram, you can find the more extended version of my reading of this source on my YouTube channel. In this first video, I will cover what exactly the Relaciones Geográficas were, as well as who were the authors of the Relación Geográfica for Poncitlán and Cuitzeo. For starters, what exactly were the Relaciones Geográficas? They were essentially a 50-question survey for the Spanish territories in Spain, as well as the Viceroyalty of Peru. The Spanish king wanted to learn more about these colonized territories under his jurisdiction. And so what we have here as a result are these ethnographic reports. If you want a more detailed description of what exactly the Relaciones Geográficas are, I recommend visiting the description of the Relaciones Geográficas found in the website for the Latin American Library at the University of Texas at Austin. Notably, their Benson Latin American Studies and Collections Department contain some of the original copies of the Relaciones Geográficas, and to find it, you can Google Relaciones Geográficas Lilias Benson digital collection and you will find the portal. So what you see here in the background, this is when I actually went to the Benson many years ago as a graduate student. Hooray for research funding, right? So what you see up here, this is my copy of the questionnaire that initiated the Relaciones Geográficas. It says here, instructo y memoria de las relaciones que se han de hacer para la descripción de las Indias, que su majestad manda hacer para el buen gobierno y ennoblecimiento de ellas. Here order you all the governors, the corregidores, the alcaldes mayores, these viceroys, audiencias, etc., etc. Then it continues with the 50 questions for the survey, right? So there's question 1, question 2, 3, 4, primeramente, en los pueblos de los españoles se diga el nombre de la comarca o provincia, blah, blah, blah. Different questions for the monasteries here, what's the churches here, the resources in the area, wild animals, the domesticated animals in the area, the types of trees, topography, asks about the indigenous peoples also, el sitio y asiento de los dichos pueblos. They want to know about the subjects. What were they named in ancient times? Who did they used to fight with? What kind of foods did they eat? Their native customs. The Relaciones Geográficas, they pertain to multiple territories. So here's Ameca, Guadalajara. So here's the one that I have up for Ameca and Guadalajara. So that's the survey itself, but let's look at Ameca, for example, just to kind of get a sense of what these look like. So here they are. Here's the Relación Geográfica for Ameca, for example. And here you see, I know not the best image here, you can see them responding to each question in the survey, right? So there's 50 questions, response to question 8, response to question 9, response to question 10. Al 10 capítulo se responde que ya dicho está poblado y fundado en la tierra, blah, 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 whatever. So you get the sense, right? So this is how many of these are formatted, right? They're in response to a different question in the survey. So that's enough of the show and tell. Now let's look at the description for what the Relaciones Geográficas are according to the Benson website. And the Benson is important because it's one of the 3 archives that contains the original Relaciones Geográficas. I will post the link to the Benson website in the description or in the comments below. So what are the Relaciones Geográficas? On May 25th, 1577, King Philip II of Spain ordered the preparation of a general description of Spain's holdings in the Indies The office of the senior chronicler cosmographer distributed instructions and a questionnaire to local officials in the viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru to direct the gathering of information. The questionnaire, comprised of 50 items, elicited the basic information about the nature of the land and the life of its peoples. The replies, known as the Relaciones Geográficas, or geographic accounts, were written between 1579 and 1585 and returned to the Council of Indies. Local officials in New Spain prepared the 43 manuscript accounts in the collection in response to Philip II's 1577 mandate. Information requested in these questionnaires covered such topics as population demographics, political jurisdictions, languages spoken locally, physical terrain, and native vegetation, providing a rich resource of historical, cultural, and geographic information on New Spain and its peoples during the 16th century. 41 relaciones pertain to territory in present-day Mexico, and 2 relate to what is now Guatemala. Again, that's the one here in the Benson. Just so you kind of get a sense, right? These are the Relaciones Geográficas that are covered in the Benson's collection. The dots here, these are the Relaciones Geográficas that are represented in the Benson sample. But there are many, many, many other Relaciones Geográficas. Now, there are some inconvenient truths about the nature of the Relaciones Geográficas, and that is that there is no one master archive that has all of the Relaciones Geográficas held together today, right? The Relaciones Geográficas are held at separate archival repositories. According to the Benson website, there were only 191 responses to this questionnaire, and we only know of 167 of them, and 43 of these are held in the Benson. The rest of the Relaciones Geográficas are at the Archivo General de Indias in Seville in Spain, as well as the Real Academia de la Historia in Madrid as well. If you want to access them, it's really a question of you doing your research, depending on which region you're looking for, and figuring out also seeing if you can access it at an archive. Is it published as in a primary source reader, maybe? Okay, so now that we know what the Relaciones Geográficas are, let's look at the contents of the Relación Geográfica for Poncitlán and Cuitzeo. All right, so what do we know about this document? So originally it was published in 1585. But the publication I have here, it's reprinted in a 1947 primary source reader. I actually got this, I found that it was published in Papeles de Nueva España, Segunda Serie, Geográfica y Estadística, pages 221 to 260. It's titled as the Relación de Poncitlán y Cuitzeo, and just as a side note for researchers, if you're at an academic institution, I acquired this through the interlibrary loan system. So that's the awesome thing, is I didn't have to travel physically to an archive. This was already printed somewhere. I found out about it, learned about the citation, and decided to research it myself. And this was when I was a student at the University of Texas at El Paso. So there are some annotations here from when I was a student. So let's get into it. So I'm going to go ahead and read the Spanish version, and then I'll start off. I'll end with an English translation, my English transliteration. And then, of course, provide some commentary here and there. En el Valle de Cuitzeo y Poncitlán, provincia de la ciudad de Guadalajara del Nuevo Reino de Galicia, en 9 días del mes de marzo de 1585 años, el ilustre señor Antonio de Medina, alcalde mayor y corregidor de los dichos pueblos y su partido por su majestad, en cumplimiento de la instrucción y memoria de la relación que se ha de hacer para la descripción de su majestad, manda hacer, hizo parecer ante sí a los alcaldes y principales y naturales antiguos de los dichos pueblos, sus sujetos, y estando presentes ante su merced, y de mí el presente escribano e intérprete, que entienden y hablan la lengua mexicana y coca, todos ellos juntos, y de cada uno por sí se informe e hizo la averiguación siguiente. So again, this reads in the valley of Cuitzeo and Poncitlán, province of the city of Guadalajara. So this is in the Lake Chapala basin towards the north, right? For folks who have been to Lake Chapala, if you've been to Chapala, you know this region. Probably more familiar or heard of Poncitlán. Poncitlán is the district that oversees Chapala, Mezcala, Ajijic, among others in that region. In the valley of Cuitzeo and Poncitlán, in the province in the city of Guadalajara, of the New Kingdom of Galicia. So as you know, Nueva Galicia, right, is this region the name of the viceroyalty given to this region, and they even had their own audiencia. So it was sort of their administrative boundary, I guess you could say. So this region is considered a province of Guadalajara, and it's part of the larger kingdom of Nueva Galicia under Spanish rule. Again, a reminder that this was recorded in the year 1585, 9th of March, and we learned about the name of the alcalde mayor and the corregidor who was in charge of this area, who put this document together. His name is Antonio de Medina. And so we learn, of course, that he didn't do this on his own, as it says here, in compliance with the instructions and memoria and the relación that was ordered by Your Majesty, that survey, right, the 50-question survey that we saw earlier. We also see here who are some of the other folks involved in putting together these documents, right? So I mentioned the Naturales Antiguos de los Dichos Pueblos. Now, as a side note, like many colonial sources produced at this time, it's very rare for us to actually get the names of who those indigenous informants are. On very rare occasions, I have seen in a few cases of Relaciones Geográficas where they'll mention the name of an indigenous principal, whether that's, if it's a Christianized native or someone who helped to produce the document that was of some importance to the Spanish chroniclers who are collecting these relaciones, but unfortunately for the most part we don't know what their identities are. But other characters mentioned here, there's also the escribano, right, the notary, the person who's writing all this information down as it's being read to him or related to him verbally. There's also interpreters, somebody who speaks both Spanish and the indigenous languages being mentioned here, which is interesting, right? So this suggests that there was somebody here, a translator who spoke both Coca and perhaps also Nahuatl, right? When they're talking about speaking the Mexican language, they're referring to Nahuatl, right? Because we know in this region there were not only Coca speakers, but there were also Nahuatl speakers, right? So we often called it Nahuatl corrupto, and the speakers of that were known as Tecos. But anyways, so we learned that there's an escribano here, who's a notary who's writing this information down, translator who speaks both the Mexican and the Nahuatl and Coca, right? And they provided the relation that follows. So that's what it says here in this first paragraph. So primeramente, el primer capítulo fue el descubridor y conquistador de la dicha provincia, Nuño de Guzmán, por orden y mandado del vicerrey de la Nueva España, don Antonio de Mendoza. Fue el tiempo de su descubrimiento y conquista el año de hueco. Okay, so blank. So most likely there was a tear in the page. It says here, firstly, in the first chapter, the discoverer and conqueror of the said province was Nuño de Guzmán, who was a bastard. And if you know about the conquest of Nueva Galicia, if you've read Ida Altman's work, The War for Mexico's West, you know why I consider him a bastard. Nuño de Guzmán, by order of the Viceroy of New Spain, Don Antonio de Mendoza. The time of his discovery and conquest was the year of blank. Presumably that was most likely 1530. Well, at least the conquest, right, of this region was 1530 if we're talking about Nuño de Guzmán, when he began that campaign to conquer Nueva Galicia. Al onceno capítulo del pueblo de Cuitzeo al pueblo de Poncitlán, corregimiento, susodicho, hay 3 leguas de uno al otro y es cabecera de doctrina del dicho pueblo de Cuitzeo con sus sujetos, sí u otros pueblos sujetos al dicho pueblo de Poncitlán en tributo el pueblo de Ocotlán de frailes agustinos. The 11th chapter just tells us here geographic extent, right, of this territory from the pueblo of Cuitzeo to the town of Poncitlán, the aforementioned district. There are 3 leagues from one another, and is the cabecera of the doctrina of the said town of Cuitzeo and its subjects, and other towns subject to the said town of Poncitlán, which also provide tribute to the town of Ocotlán, which is populated by Augustinian friars, not Franciscans. Response to question 12, it's kind of a boring question, right? But nevertheless, this gives you a sense of what the limits are, right, of this what are the jurisdictions, right, of Poncitlán and Cuitzeo in colonial times? Well, correction. It will be considered boring if you don't have family members from these towns, or if you're not particularly interested in these towns for research purposes. For folks who are interested in doing family genealogy, knowing the place names of these towns is useful, right? Because what if that name of your family's town shows up in the Relación Geográfica? Luckily, Jalisco is one of these places where the names of many of these towns has remained constant since colonial times. Not all of them, but many of them. Places like Ajijic, Chapala, Mezcala. So in colonial times, right, now that these territories are under Spanish rule, this question 12 is important, right, to give the Spanish sort of an idea of like how far away each town that's under their jurisdiction, what are the limits. Al 12º capítulo hay del dicho pueblo de Cuitzeo al pueblo de Chamain 2 leguas y de Chamain a Chinehuatengo 3 leguas, el uno pueblo tras otro río arriba, y del dicho pueblo de Cuitzeo al pueblo de Ocotlán 2 tiros de arcabuz. It's an interesting measure, right? Arcabuz, right? Like bullets. 2 tiros de arcabuz, right? So I guess 2 shots, right, of an arch. Río en medio. Y de Ocotlán a San Juan, media legua, y de San Juan a Xochitlán, otra media, y de Xochitlán a Santiago, 2 y media, río abajo. Y por la otra del río hay del dicho pueblo del Cuitzeo al pueblo de San Luis, 1 legua, y de San Luis a Santa Cruz, media, y entre medias de los dichos pueblos de Ocotlán y San Juan para otro río, y a la orilla está Sula, legua y media de ellos, y de Sula a Otatlán, otra legua y media, y de Otatlán a Zapotlán 2, y de Zapotlán a Tototlán 3 leguas por el atajo y sierra, y por lo llano 4 las leguas son grandes, y los caminos por tierra llana y derechos. I'm going to continue with 13 and the rest of the Relación Geográfica in the next video. I will see you soon.